My name is Deacon Peter Gittens, and I thank Father Peter Turon for inviting me back to offer another Faith and Reason lecture at the Newman Catholic Center, University of Toronto. 2 years ago, I had the privilege and pleasure of presenting on John Henry Newman's Anglican and Catholic Mariology. The focus of this year's Faith and Reason lecture is on St. John Henry Newman's The Idea of a University. Reflecting on his life, John Henry Newman wrote in a journal in 1863, 16 years before becoming a cardinal in 1879, that he had fulfilled the object of ambition of all rising men in Oxford, that he never wished for anything better or higher than to live and die a fellow of Oriel. In 1822, at the age of 21, he was elected a fellow of Oriel College in Oxford. In this same journal, he also wrote, "Now, from first to last, education has been my line." In 1828, 4 years after his ordination as an Anglican priest, he was appointed the vicar of the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford, and until 1843, he served the University of Oxford community as priest and theologian, preaching his famous nightly sermons to a standing room only at the University Church, packed with students who preferred to skip their evening meal rather than to miss one of his sermons. Newman became a Roman Catholic in 1845 and was ordained a priest in Rome in 1847. In 1851, the Archbishop of Armagh in Ireland, after consulting with Newman on the prospects of establishing a Catholic university in Ireland, offered him the post of rector, which he readily accepted because, as he says, "From the very first moment of my Catholic existence, I wished for a Catholic university." In 1854, Newman was formally installed as the first rector of the new Catholic University of Ireland, a position he held for 4 years until his resignation in 1858. Newman's The Idea of a University is not a systematic work, rather it is an occasional work, arising from the publication in 1859 of 10 discourses on the scope and nature of education addressed to the Catholics of Dublin in 1853, which was prepared as a lead-up to launching the new Catholic University of Ireland. Following an abbreviated edition in 1859, Newman published in 1873 a larger edition, The Idea of a University Defined and Illustrated. This edition contained 9 of the 10 original discourses and 10 additional lectures on essays previously published. This book, acclaimed as one of the most influential written on university education, is important because it expresses much of Newman's advocacy of a liberal education as the principal purpose of a university. This classic work also expresses Newman's deepest thinking about theology in its relationship to other disciplines such as philosophy, literature, and the natural sciences. Both Newman's leadership of the Catholic University of Ireland and his discourses on university education were occurring at a time of crisis in education. This crisis in education, particularly higher education, and causing fragmentation in education dates back to his time as a tutor at Oriel College. A challenge of this crisis was the question of whether university education should primarily be useful and particular as opposed to liberal and universal. Useful or particular education in this context meant an education focused on training, on teaching skills necessary for good employment with a lucrative income, as opposed to universal or liberal education, which focused on lifelong learning, or as Newman would say, the cultivation of the intellect. For one who saw the goal of a university education as the grasping of truth, truth that was rooted in God, Newman saw education as a journey to the truth, not where you over-educate and load the memory of the student with a mass of undigested knowledge. Instead, the goal of a universal or liberal education was the true enlargement of the mind, which is the power of viewing many things at once as one whole, of referring them to their true place in the universal system of understanding their respective values and determining their moral dependence. A provost at Oriel from 1814 to 1828, Dr. Edward Copleston, whose view on education greatly influenced Newman, that education was to exercise the mind of the student and not to pour in knowledge. This was to become a fundamental principle in Newman's idea of a university. Newman had set up the Catholic University of Ireland not only to teach the liberal arts, but also medicine, law, engineering, and astronomy, and other disciplines. Newman recognized that all sciences and professions have a legitimate place in a university. The problem was not with the existence of many disciplines, but with the lack of coordination and the fragmentation in which every discipline tended to make itself the center of all truth. However, Newman wanted to correct this one-sidedness in viewing reality as a single undivided whole, with the object of knowledge being truth and all knowledge forming one large system or complex fact. The main point of education for Newman was to get a connected grasp of the real in its full range. Newman saw the inclusion of these subjects as necessary because the university education which for him was universal, was by its very name, professors, was the goal of the cultivation of liberal education. Newman's use of liberal education and of the liberal arts might be confusing to a modern reader, and this has been a source of misunderstanding of Newman's idea of liberal education. Consequently, it is necessary to understand the meaning of the word liberal in relation to liberal education as used by Newman in 19th century England. In Newman's time, liberal education primarily focused on the classics, literature, humanities, including philosophy and theology, but not to the exclusion of other academic subjects such as mathematics and the natural sciences. What Newman in his lecture, Christianity and Letters, in the second part of the idea of a university, referred to liberal arts, he was thinking of the 7 liberal arts of the medieval university made up of grammar, rhetoric, logic, the trivium, and the sciences of mathematics, which was divided into 4, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music, known as the quadrivium, making in all 7, which are known by the name of the 7 liberal arts. And thus, a definite school of intellect was formed, founded on ideas and methods of a distinctive character. Further, Ian Kerr points out that grammar certainly involved literature of Greece and Rome, but this education in the arts is hardly what we would mean by an education in the arts and classics. In this same lecture on Christianity and Letters, as Ian Kerr points out, Newman said that these liberal arts were able in the Middle Ages to withstand the challenge of the new subjects of theology, law, and medicine because they were acknowledged as before to be the best instruments of mental cultivation and the best guarantee of intellectual progress. For Newman, the special characteristics or property of a university is liberal education or liberal knowledge. Liberal as opposed to servile. Newman explains what he means by servile by saying, by servile work is understood, as our catechisms inform us, bodily labor, mechanical employment, and the like, in which the mind has little or no part. Liberal education and liberal pursuits are exercises of the mind, of reason, and of reflection. Liberal education is philosophical, embracing general ideas. In characterizing liberal education as universal education, he was making it clear that knowledge for him primarily is liberal and universal and not useful and particular. In speaking about universal and liberal knowledge, he meant something intellectual, something which grasps what it perceives through the senses, something which takes a view of things, which sees more than the senses convey, which reasons upon what it sees, and while it sees, which invests it with an idea. For him, the principle of the real dignity in knowledge, its worth, its desirableness, considered irrespective of the result, is the germ within it of a scientific or philosophical process. This is how it comes to be an end in itself. This is why it admits of being called liberal. Not to know the relative disposition of things is the state of slaves or children. On the other hand, to have mapped out the universe is the boast, or at least the ambition of philosophy. Liberal education is that which stands on its own pretensions and is independent, self-sufficient, and complete. Knowledge ceases to be liberal and becomes useful if it loses its intrinsic attributes of independence, self-sufficiency, and completeness. Knowledge is liberal when it is an end and not just the means or an instrument, but a good, excellent in itself, self-sufficient, and apart from every external and ulterior object. Liberal knowledge is a gentleman's knowledge. It is the scope of a university. Newman goes on to say that liberal education makes not the Christian, not the Catholic, but the gentleman, and it is well to be a gentleman, to have a cultivated intellect. These are the connatural qualities of a large education. They are the objects of a university. It is clear that in Newman's mind, the object of a liberal education, higher education, is mental activity. It is mental excellence. In citing two ways of using knowledge, Newman highlights two methods of education, and they are: one, useful; two, liberal. Useful education is that which is mechanical and employs particular ideas. Newman also referred to particular education as commercial education. Newman was not discrediting the mechanical and the useful in favor of the liberal and philosophical. He was excluding commercial and useful studies from his idea of a university because, in his mind, since the end of a university is liberal knowledge, only the liberal subjects ought to be taught. Even if it would seem that Newman were attacking specialization and vocational training and speaking in favor of liberal or universal education to the exclusion of particular education, he was not. He says, "Let me not be thought to deny the necessity or to decry the benefit of such attention to what is particular and practical as belongs to the useful or mechanical arts. Life could not go on without them. We owe our daily welfare to them. Their exercise is the duty of the many, and we owe to the many a debt of gratitude for fulfilling that duty. I only say that knowledge, in proportion as it tends more and more to be particular, ceases to be knowledge." Newman was affirming the sacrifice of the specialist who strove to deepen knowledge of his field. In his words, there can be no doubt that every art is improved by confining the professor of it to that single study, and the art itself is advanced by this concentration of mind in his service. Nevertheless, Newman did not exclude the modern applied sciences, nor did he did not exclude the modern applied sciences which did not present a threat to liberal education. In other words, it is possible for one person to cultivate it in both ways at the same time. The main point is that there are two ways of using knowledge, but those who use it in one way and not likely to use it in both ways. In further contrasting a liberal education with a youthful commercial education or a professional education, Newman made it clear that no one can deny that commerce and professions afford scope for the highest and most diversified powers of mind. He went on to acknowledge that there are bodily exercises or non-mental pursuits which can be called liberal, and there are mental exercises which are not liberal. As an example, he mentioned that in ancient times, the practitioners in medicine were commonly slaves. Yet it was an art as intellectual in its nature, in spite of the pretense, fraud, and fakery and quackery with which it might then, as now, be debased, as it was heavenly in its aim. On the other hand, there are also intellectual activities which are technically called liberal, example, some commercial and professional activities, which, though highly intellectual, are not simply called liberal. And there are mercantile occupations that are not liberal at all. For Newman, knowledge has a twofold end, for this world or for the next world. Thus, liberal knowledge, as Christian and religious concerned with eternity and the next world, in contrast with youthful knowledge concerned with the temporal and secular objects of this world. Knowledge, which is neither beneficial to body nor soul, is not worth the trouble acquiring. The university is more a place of education than of instruction. Instruction implies learning methodology, rules committed to memory. Education is a higher word. It is the communication of knowledge. It implies an action upon the mental nature and the formation of character. It is something individual and permanent, commonly spoken of in connection with religion and virtue. Looking at the characteristics of the cultivation of the intellect relevant to the scope of a university, Newman looked at mere knowledge, philosophical knowledge, and religious knowledge, and asked, does the scope of a university lie in the acquirement and attainment of mere knowledge? Is it expertise in particular arts and pursuits of professional knowledge? Does it lie in moral and religious proficiency in religious knowledge? And to these questions, he affirms that the scope of a university and the end of a liberal education is not mere knowledge, that is, acquiring and memorizing a great deal of facts, passive knowledge. Then he says, a great memory does not make a philosopher. The true end of intellectual training and of university is thought or reason exercised upon knowledge, or what may be called philosophy. Knowledge is the expansion of the mind through extensive reading. It is like the awareness of a new and bigger ideas, enlightenment, following the venturing into new and different places. Communication of knowledge, enlargement or enlightenment consists not in passive reception and accumulation, but through the mind's energetic digestion, making the objects of our knowledge subjectively our own, and comparing ideas with one another and systematizing them, moving forward, yet connecting with the past, analyzing and harmonizing, and taking a position, not like a seafarer who goes everywhere and sees everything with no story to tell, but only able to relate the sights. He goes on to say, to have even a portion of this illuminative reason and true philosophy is the highest state to which nature can aspire in the way of intellect. It puts the mind above the influence of change and necessity, above anxiety, suspense, unsettlement, and superstition, which is the lot of many. Education is neither recreation nor accomplishments. He says, recreations are not education. Accomplishments are not education. Do not say that people must be educated when after all you only mean amused, refreshed, soothed, put into good spirits and good humor, but kept from vicious excesses. I do not say that such amusements, such occupations of mine are not a great gain, but they are not education. Stuffing birds or playing string instruments is an elegant pastime and a resource to the idle, but it is not education. It does not form or cultivate the intellect. Newman goes on to say that education is a high word. It is preparation for knowledge, and it is in the imparting of knowledge in proportion to that preparation. Education is a quest for intellectual improvement. To improve the intellect, one must ascend, generalize, share our knowledge, and mount above the level. Enlargement of the mind requires a university whose aim was not merely passing courses and earning degrees, but one that aimed at enlarging the mind. For Newman, a university is, according to the usual designation, an alma mater, knowing her children, one who, knowing her children, one by one, not a foundry or a mint or a treadmill. If asked to choose between a so-called university with no residency requirements and tutorials, Newman would choose as the better, not in a moral sense, a university with no professors or examinations, which merely brought a number of students and tutors together for 2 or 3 or 4 years. In this university, they are sure to learn from one another, even if there be no one to teach them. The conversation of all is but a series of lectures to each, and they gain for themselves new ideas and views, fresh matter of thoughts, and distinct principles for judging and acting day by day. Newman held that the compulsory study must be good and idleness an intolerable mischief. He nevertheless says, of the 2 courses, the one that was the more successful in training, molding, enlarging the mind, which sent out men, the more fitted for their secular duties, which produced better public men, men of the world, men whose names would descend to posterity. Newman states that his preference by saying, I have no hesitation in giving the preference to that university which did nothing over that which exacted of its members an acquaintance with every science under the sun. Two problematic areas were a growing aversion to the classics and a dismissal of theology and religious education as academic disciplines. As if the classics were useless knowledge, the prevailing utilitarian influence of Jeremy Bentham sought to discredit the external status of the classics in favor of what they termed useful knowledge, leading to useful profession. Similarly, theology and religious studies were not included in the academic curriculum of the new established university in London. Embracing the relativism of Enlightenment thought, theology was being relegated from knowledge to emotions and feelings, and he blamed the evangelicals for that. Newman vehemently reacted to any idea of reducing theology to sentiment. For him, religion and theology were matters of faith. Universal education, which aimed at the pursuit of truth, was Newman's primary focus for a university. Truth was absolute reality, and not a relative and negotiable thing. Truth for Newman was a divine attribute. Truth and belief in God went hand in hand. Truth and belief were so self-evident for Newman that he wrote, "Belief in God is no more than an acknowledgement of existing sensible powers and phenomena which none but an idiot can deny." Truth has two attributes, power and beauty. In relating this to useful and liberal knowledge, useful knowledge is the possession of truth as power, and liberal knowledge is the apprehension of truth as the beautiful. A universal education should entail philosophy and theology, and that one could graduate from a university without having taken a single course in theology or theology would be infuriating to Newman. It should be pointed out that what a 21st century student might understand by the term philosophy was not what was intended by Newman. Unlike the modern reader's understanding of philosophy at a university as courses to be taken for academic credit, Newman spoke about the special philosophy or liberal or philosophical knowledge as the end of university education and of liberal or philosophical knowledge. And he saw these as very tangible, real, and sufficient, and a sufficient end, and a comprehensive view of truth in all its branches. Newman spoke of philosophy as the science of sciences. Philosophy was not a subject to be studied, but a process of learning to think properly, by which one is gradually initiated in the largest and truest philosophical views. The more the mind is formed and trained, the more philosophical, in Newman's view, it becomes. Defining what he meant by philosophy, Newman wrote, "In default of a recognized term in the English language for intellectual proficiency or perfection, I have called the perfection of virtue of the intellect by the name of philosophy, philosophical knowledge, or enlargement of mind or illumination, terms which are not uncommonly given to it by writers of the day." For Newman, philosophy was not another academic discipline. Philosophy was a form of knowledge. Philosophy was the perfection or virtue of the intellect to acquire intellectual excellence. Everything has its own perfection, be it higher or lower in the scale of things, and the perfection of one is not the perfection of another. Newman likened the university to an empire made up of many nations and provinces, which maps out the territory of the intellect and sees that the boundaries of each province are religiously respected and that there is neither encroachment nor surrender on any side. Further, the university acts as an umpire between truth and truth, and taking into account the nature and importance of each, assigns to all their due order and preference. Keeping up with the concept of a university being an empire, Newman makes reference to the imperial intellect and philosophical habit of mind. He was speaking of knowledge from the Latin word scientia, science, to mean philosophy. He said, "Philosophy, then, or science, is related to knowledge in this way. Knowledge is called by the name of science or philosophy when it is acted upon, informed, or, if I may use a strong figure, impregnated by reason. Reason is a principle of the intrinsic fecundity of knowledge." Similarly, realizing that English has no word to express the meaning of liberal education as idea of intellectual cultivation or of a cultivated intellect, Newman says, It were well if English, like the Greek language, possessed some definite word to express simply and generally intellectual proficiency or perfection. I'm not able to find such a term. Knowledge indeed, and science expresses purely intellectual ideas, but still not a state or quality of the intellect. Newman frequently used the word culture in terms of intellectual culture, whether it be as the business or the function of a university. The terms intellectual culture, or as Newman would at other times say, the culture of the intellect. The culture of the intellect is a cultivation of the intellect, in other words, the exercise of the intellect in order to its perfect state. It was the business of a university to make this intellectual culture its direct scope or to employ itself in the education of the intellect. Theology. Theology is a central concern for Newman. In Newman's idea of a university, theology could not be excluded. Writing within the context of the proposed Catholic University in Ireland, Newman argues primarily from the nature of the university as a seat of universal learning and from the interconnectedness of all truth, that if a university claims to teach universal knowledge, if it claims to teach truth, theology cannot be excluded unless it is denied that theology is a significant field of knowledge. Relegating the study of God to seminary is unwarranted because theology has implications for other sciences. If there be religious truth at all, we cannot shut our eyes to it without prejudice to truth of every kind, physical, metaphysical, historical, and moral, for it bears upon all truth. He continued, if the Catholic faith is true, a university cannot exist externally to the Catholic pale, for it cannot teach universal knowledge if it does not teach Catholic theology. In other words, a Catholic university would be deficient as a university, no matter how good it would be in other secular disciplines, if revealed truth and the interpretation in Catholic light were ignored. Although Newman tended to agree with those who held that natural theology ought to be taught in the university and revealed theology to be taught in the seminary, he, however, dwells heavily upon theological truth that can be established by unaided reason, but he is quick to assert that no Catholic can tolerate the omission of revealed facts and principles that go beyond natural reason and are known by faith to be most true. In later discourses, he notes that due to fallen human nature, reason will quickly become sluggish and lead one astray unless it submits to the guidance of faith. Newman thought that divine revelation was necessary in order to prevent reason from going astray. Newman's conversion to Roman Catholicism convinced him that since Catholicism is true, he would admit of no apologetics or doctrines that the other Christians hold in common or doctrines specific to Catholicism. His basic principle is that Catholicism is one whole and admits of no compromise or modifications. For Newman, there is no such thing as religion in general or Christianity in general. Newman held that the different branches of knowledge differ in importance, that theology is the most important of all because it comes from heaven. Its truths were given once for all at the first. They are more certain on account of the giver than those of mathematics. Thus, Newman affirmed the importance of theology over secular sciences to such an extent that he argued that if theology is a branch of knowledge of wide reception, of philosophical structure, of unutterable importance, and of supreme influence, to what a conclusion are we brought from those two premises but this, that to withdraw theology from a public school is to impair the completeness and to invalidate the trustworthiness of all that is actually taught in them. Newman deemed theology to be so important in a university that its absence would create a void that other disciplines then would seek to fill, even if they lacked the necessary competence. He said, "If you drop any science out of the circle of knowledge, you cannot keep its place vacant for it. That science is forgotten. The other science close up. They exceed their proper bounds and intrude where they have no right. If ethics were sent into banishment, its territory would soon disappear. Other sciences would encroach and take its place. If theology were out of possession, and not only so, but those sciences would be plainly exceeding their rights and their capacities in seizing upon it. They would be sure to teach wrongly where they had no mission to teach at all." That theology for Newman is a worthy branch of liberal knowledge and education is indisputable. Theology, like any other body of knowledge that can be gained at a university, must remain philosophical. In Newman's words, knowledge, I say, is then especially liberal or sufficient for itself apart from every external or ulterior object when and so far as it is philosophical. Theology ceases to be knowledge and becomes a business, making use of theology when, instead of being cultivated as a contemplation, it becomes limited to the purposes of the pulpit or catechesis. What theology thus exercise is not simple knowledge, but rather it is an art or a business making use of theology. Newman saw the university as a place to prepare people to take their rightful place in the world. A university, he said, is not a seminary. It is a place to fit men of the world for the world. And while we cannot possibly keep them from plunging into the world with all its ways and principles and maxims when that time comes, but we can prepare them against what is inevitable. We succeed in preparing today's students to become tomorrow's members of a great world in making the world his university. Nevertheless, a Catholic university would be remiss if it sent its graduates out into the world accomplished in all knowledge except theology and Christian knowledge. Literature. There is no doubt that Newman highlights theology as the highest of all the subjects in a university, and that as such higher than literature. But the same Newman also extensively shows the importance of the study of literature in a liberal education. Stressing the importance of the study of literature as a preparation for life in this world, he writes, "Did we leave out literature from education? For why do we educate except to prepare for the world? Why do we cultivate the intellect of the many beyond the first elements of knowledge, except for this world? Will it be much matter in this world to come whether our bodily health or wealth, or whether our intellectual strength was more or less exempt, of course, as this world in all its circumstances, a trial for the next? If then a university is a direct preparation for this world, let it be what it professes." Newman was convinced that difficult and divisive the question may be, even to zealous and religious Catholics, the Church's policy was not the exclusion of literature from secular schools, but the admission of it. He said, "Let her, the Church, do for literature in one way what she has done for science in another. Each has its imperfection, and she has her remedy for each. The Church, according to Newman, fears no knowledge, but she purifies all, and she represses no element of our nature, but it cultivates the whole." Literature does not argue, but disclaims and insinuates. It is multiform and versatile. It persuades instead of convincing. It seduces, it carries captive, it appeals to the sense of humor or to the imagination or to the stimulus of curiosity. It makes its way by means of gaiety, satire, romance, the beautiful, the pleasurable. Newman's and the Church's appreciation of and for literature lay in that her principle is one and the same throughout, not to prohibit truth of any kind, but to see that no doctrines pass under the name of truth, but those that claim it rightfully. Newman, in his lectures, which formed the basis of his idea of a university, made remarkable little mention of the moral and pastoral formation of his students. His primary focus was the affirmation that a university was a place to foster knowledge, not morality. It was his expectation that tutors in their respective colleges, just as he was a tutor at Oriel College, would be models of morality and piety for their students and would offer them spiritual guidance. With reference to a Catholic university, Newman says, when the Church founds a university, she is not cherishing talent, genius, or knowledge for their own sake, but for the sake of her children, with a view to their spiritual welfare and their religious influence and usefulness, with the object of training them to fill their respective posts in life better and of making them more intelligent, capable, active members of society. Beyond the specific finality of the university lies a spiritual aim, not specific to university as such. No doubt, much more could be said about Newman's idea of a university, but time does not permit. Nevertheless, the question for us is on the relevance of a 19th century idea of a university for the 21st century. Newman's view that a university should, in theory, be open to teaching all subjects, and even if in practice it does not or could not, it should be open to teaching anything that is knowable. For Newman, all branches of knowledge are, at least, the subject matter of his teaching. Consequently, his Irish Catholic University did not teach every conceivable subject, yet it was open to doing so because all knowledge forms one whole, because its subject matter is one for the universe in its length and breadth, in so intimately being knit together that we cannot separate off portion from portion and operation from operation, except by mental abstraction. Universal knowledge recognizes that all the sciences come to us as one, and that they all relate to the one and to the same integral subject matter. None can be safely omitted, for its loss, it's a positive privation of an influence which exerts itself in the correction and the completion of the rest. This being said, we can conclude by saying that as good and necessary academic specialization may be, the 21st century university, in its effort at promoting subject area specialization, should not do so at the neglect of a universal or an integrated education. Newman lamented the fact that one could know a lot about his or her field of specialization and lack universal knowledge. Newman says that a specialist focused on particular knowledge is in danger of being absorbed and narrowed by his pursuit, whereas the student focused on liberal education know where they and their sciences stand, and having been kept from extravagance by the very rivalry of their studies, they have gained from them a special illumination and largeness of mind and freedom and self-possession, and they own this in consequence. For the 21st century student then, the question is not whether to attain a specialized education in a given field and have knowledge only about that field and lack universal knowledge. Is it perhaps better to know something about many things, which is universal knowledge, than to know a lot about one thing, particular knowledge? Thank you very much.